Well, I made it to St. Louis, and I am really, really looking forward to introducing you to one of Yogiraj Charles Bates' students for many, many years, and one of the very few people that I get to talk to about organizational development who really gets it. There are a number of people who took the ashram project, which I know you've heard me talk about, but not everybody was as interested in the OD stuff as Roger Sams and me. So Roger, thank you for being here today and for taking time to be on this interview with me today. And I know you have a great fondness and love for Yogiraj Charles Bates. So why don't you first just say how you met Yogiraj?
How I met Yogiraj? Well, I met Yogiraj when, this is before I met Yogiraj, my friend Sandy, who was the high school art teacher at the school where I was the elementary music teacher, we were both finishing up different Gestalt training things. We had both been studying at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland. We were doing different programs, but we were both very engaged in the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland. And we were both finishing up our training programs, and she and I had talked about, well, what's next? What do we do next? Because you get addicted to learning this stuff and growing in these kind of ways. So I remember Sandy came marching into my classroom, waving this letter saying, I know what we're going to do next. And she had a letter from Yogiraj where Yogiraj personally invited her to the ashram project. And when I'm describing the ashram project to people, and this may be way off, but this is how I make sense of it and remember it now, is that it was an invitation to look at how organizations change through the lens of Gestalt and yoga. And so I was really passionate about Gestalt, and I'm not, to be quite honest, I didn't have any relationship with yoga at that point in time, but I was interested in Gestalt. So, and this was a kind of a by invitation program, but you can invite any of your friends who might be interested. So literally Yogiraj came into town, into Cleveland, and Sandy and Yogiraj and I had dinner one night in a restaurant. So that's when I first met him. And I think we both decided by the end of that dinner that I would be in the ashram project. And so I committed to a year and a half of study. That's how it all started. Wow. And that lasted then for over 10 years.
We have sort of similar stories in that regard, in that I didn't have anything to do with yoga. And I remember telling Yogiraj at some point after maybe a year of tea together that whatever that spiritual stuff was, I had my woods, I had my nature, that's off limits, basically, is what I told him. I'm good. I got that part covered. But that OD stuff, I want everything you've got. Just pour it on. I want absolutely everything you've got. And it's made all the difference for me. And as you know, and as most people who know me know, the spiritual stuff grew to be even more important to me probably than the OD did. I really want you to speak about what you're doing right now, even this week. Roger is a master Orff teacher. And so I'm not going to try to do justice to describing Orff, but it is a very specific way of teaching music. And you are bringing OD and Orff together, which is fascinating to me. So first, just describe Orff briefly for those who don't know about it. And then tell us about how you're bringing organizational development and Orff together on behalf of teaching and education.
So I would describe Orff Schulwerk, and I like to say Orff Schulwerk, and Schulwerk just means schoolwork in German. So a lot of people say Orff, and Vivi was not incorrect. I guess I'm a little proper. Its full name is Orff Schulwerk.
Thank you.
And so Orff Schulwerk, my elevator speech approaches it at two levels if I want people to understand what we're doing. The first is, most people have seen the little xylophones that kids play in elementary music class. Those are Orff instruments. So Carl Orff, the composer, and if many people know Carl Orff because his piece Carmina Burana is the most performed piece of classical music that exists, orchestral music that exists. And Carl Orff's kind of a bit of a one-hit wonder in the classical music world. He's got that one big mega hit that every orchestra plays every few years, and most of the other stuff he wrote doesn't get played very much. And he had some ideas about teaching and learning, and they were pretty radical and progressive at the time. And interestingly enough, Orff Schulwerk comes out of the same Gestalt as Gestalt does. That same German, outside of the box thinking, pre-World War II people. So the same environment that birthed Gestalt birthed Orff Schulwerk, and they have a lot of similarities. So Orff Schulwerk is about those little xylophones, but what we love about those little xylophones is you can take bars off and kids can improvise and create their own music. And so my elevator speech about Orff Schulwerk is we give the kids the skills and the understanding to create their own art rather than reproduce art made by adults for them. So it's very much about getting kids to create. It's also very much an integration of music and movement and theater. Karl Orff believed that music and dance and theater are all woven together. But the main philosophy was the kids need to create their own stuff. They needed to give them, so we do a lot of making up stuff. We teach kids to improvise and compose and make up their own music and make up their own dances. And how that relates to Gestalt is when you're doing that, you kind of have to teach people how to think about what they're doing. So when you're teaching people how to think about what they're doing, Gestalt comes in really handy, because Gestalt's all about paying attention to yourself. So what I'm doing this week, actually, which is really exciting for me, is I'm teaching, I think, the first ever graduate course for music educators, for Orff Schulwerk teachers, on the Gestalt of Orff Schulwerk. I'm calling it Holding Space, the Gestalt of Orff Schulwerk. And because I think great teaching is holding space. This kind of teaching is really holding space. The days of the teacher being the person who knows everything, pouring the knowledge into the kids who don't know anything, and getting them to take tests and give the answers back, that kind of education, I don't think that's what we're about anymore. Great teachers are holding space for children and adult, whoever they're holding space for, to construct their own learning and to discover their own truths and to figure things out. And in the cases of Orff Schulwerk, and to make beautiful art in the process of figuring things out. So this week, I'm teaching a room full of music teachers about Gestalt theory, and we're talking a lot about how that shows up in our classrooms.
A lot of you hear me talk about sovereignty. And for me, one of the pieces of Gestalt really is about the wholeness of an individual, the wholeness of a system, and that sense of being able to be sovereign, not because of what's going on around me, but because I am whole. And some of you have also heard me talk about the sense of needing to, if you want to change, you just have to have it become more of itself. And so I love that your work is bringing those two things together. You're doing it in education, and the reason that I wanted to interview you specifically, Roger, is because, as you know, I am working on the healthcare side of things, specifically for bringing medicine to a place of its sovereignty, to be able to deliver on the promise of safety first, of do no harm, first do no harm. And one of the ways in which I think we have disabled healthcare in large part is because although we aspire to do no harm, we do not set up systems properly for that to happen. Right from the get-go, we begin to bring shame and blame. We begin to belittle the people who are studying and learning, and the education system for medicine, certainly not 100%, but in large part, is not treating the individuals as whole beings. So I would like for you to just speak, if you would, how do you bring the educators that you are trying to train, and they're educating young children, what are some of the basics that support the sovereignty of the individual, that have their wholeness be up front and center, so that they can actually be that expressed self, not mimicking only, but actually creating something anew from each person?
Yes, this is exactly what we spent all day yesterday talking about. So yesterday, the theme for my class was self as instrument. And we talked about So I gave them, because nobody's writing about Orff Schulwerk in the music room, because we're the first people to ever take a class on it. So there is no literature to look at about Orff in the music room. So I had them read an article about self as instrument for OSD practitioners. And then I had them break into small groups and talk about what they learned about self as instrument. Yeah, it's helpful for me to actually be able to see myself there. I don't, because then I know if I'm interesting or not. So, anyhow,
You're interesting, trust me.
Anyhow, so far I'm engaged with myself. So anyhow, like to get, so for music teachers to be maximally effective, really the most important thing is self as instrument. And so they read about OSD, how an OSD practitioner would use self as instrument. And then in small groups, they talked a lot about themselves and how they are the instrument in their own classrooms. And then we came back together, and they all shared what they learned from each other, and I drove points home. But what was important for them, from my vantage point, to understand by the end was there are layers of self as instrument for us as music teachers. And it shows up, one is your personal musicianship matters. So when people are taking Orff Schulwerk training, it's not just about how to teach children. We really challenge them to grow as musicians in the media of Orff Schulwerk, which are, we call singing, saying, moving, playing, singing, dancing, speaking, and playing instruments. So we challenge them as musicians in the media we work in. So their skills, so they grow chops, basically, what we call in music land chops. We want them to have strong musical chops. And I say to them, because you are your student's model for what a good musician looks like and sounds like. So your musicianship matters. Then we talked about how your pedagogical skills matter, and how when you're a beginning teacher, like pretty much all you got brain space to think about is, what do I do next? 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 Because that's what you have to think about when you're a beginning teacher, and how you grow your skill and you grow your capacity to know what to do without thinking about what to do. But that's like you build your muscle, and you just start to learn what works and what doesn't work. And we talked about, with these teachers, we talked about that point in time where as a teacher you used to all of a sudden look back and you think, I'm not thinking about my teaching anymore. It's because the self has accumulated enough mastery as a pedagogue. You don't have to think, what am I doing next? And as soon as you don't have to think about what you're doing next, then you have so much brain space to pay attention to the kids in your classroom in a new kind of way. So self as instrument is about you have to cultivate your pedagogical skills so that your self can show up as a teacher without thinking about being a teacher. One of my favorite writers, Parker Palmer, says, technique is what you need until the real teacher shows up.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, you need technique until you've assimilated it and you don't have to talk about it anymore. And then you just show up. And when you reach a point where you've assimilated the pedagogical technique and you just start showing up and teaching, then class becomes really magical, because like so much more of you is available to be attentive to the kids. So musicianship matters, pedagogical skills matter, and then like how the kids impact you and how their music like you use yourself as an instrument to communicate to children how beautiful they are and how the music they just made or the dance they creating impacted you. So like if the kids just did I'm literally getting goosebumps thinking about it. So if the kids just, say they're first graders, and they just made up dances to a haiku that they wrote in the music class before, and they just made up these dances that to first graders are so tender and sweet and beautiful. And I feel into that with them, and you feel into the aesthetic experience that they're having. And then when that's over, I use myself as instrument to say, girls and boys, that was so beautiful. Like you gave me goosebumps, that was so beautiful. You start talking to children from your heart place about how their art impacts you, like how their art moves you, how their goodness and their beauty moves you. So self as instrument shows up in those three different layers in our classroom.
Thank you. I can imagine what that might feel like in a medical environment. in if you took those three principles and used self as instrument, and those three aspects, and taught from that place, so that what you're creating are masters. We study a lot in Gestalt OD around mimesis and how important that is, and it's a very instrumental part of Pigs Eat Wolves, going into partnership with your dark side, as you know. You spend a whole phase in the mimesis phase. It's an important one, and sometimes it gets like thrown out as an option, but it's actually really, really critical as a stepping stone to being able to actually come to one's own self as instrument, and then to have an environment that is actually conducive for that. I don't want to limit that to young people. I don't want to limit that to elementary education. I don't want to limit that to the young ones in our life. I think that level of understanding it's never too late to begin to be a new kind of learner. And the people that I have the most respect for in healthcare settings, who are working on patient safety, or safety for everyone, not just for patients, they're redefining how we teach. And so the reason I wanted you to hear from Roger today is because he is teaching differently, and I'm going to be sending this out to a few choice people who are redesigning curriculums as we speak. In fact, I'll be moderating a panel in September on this very topic of how are we educating our medical professionals in a way that allows them their sovereignty, so that they can actually be of like their solid mind when they are honoring at the bedside, or at the administrative level, or at the teaching level. So I have one more question for you, Roger, if you're willing.
I'm game.
All right, thank you. I would love for you to just talk about the systems level that you see at education. You have been in specifically music education for how many years now? 30, 40, 35 years. You've seen a lot change over these years. I want you to speak to the systems changes that give you promise and hope, and where you think we still have a ways to go for music education specifically to be really, truly effective.
Well, I think in some ways, I'm grateful that music educators haven't borne the brunt of the worst of what's not going well in schools, because standardized testing hasn't totally. Music education in most places is not driven by standardized testing. I mean, one of the greatest heartbreaks to me about education right now is the way in which we are using standardized testing to shape schools in ways that aren't supportive of children learning. And pretty much everybody in education knows that we're doing things that are not helpful to children, but the people that make the choices and tell us what we have to do require that we teach to these tests, which don't really measure what's most important. And so there's a way in which music educators have more freedom to do what they choose as they believe is best than many classroom educators who have to teach to these standardized tests, which are driving schools and stressing out children and causing us to not focus on what's best for the children we serve. So what gives me hope in many ways is the clarity around which so many people know that what we've been doing lately isn't helpful. Like that, it's really helpful.
And people are beginning to understand.
Yeah,
that.
I mean, teachers have known for a long time, but like we're not helping children by being hyper focused on competitive test scores. And it's not how to nurture human beings, and it's not even the best way to nurture nurture learning. It's not helpful. So I'm excited about possibilities for us choosing to measure what successful education looks like differently, other than standardized test scores. I'm really excited about the kind of work I'm doing now, that there's actually a university that wants me to come in and talk about this stuff, and is excited for me to come in and spend a week really nurturing teachers with ideas that are mostly rooted around their wholeness. Like, we're spending an entire week focusing on their wholeness so they can show up. Like everything you said about wholeness, we said on my first day of my class, it's like, this is about you. We're going to start paying attention to your kids at the very end of the week, but for most of the week, we're going to focus on your wholeness. Because if you're not showing up whole in your classroom, you're not, your best self isn't showing up. Because it's about wholeness.
Yeah. The education programs that I've seen most effective for physicians and clinicians they spend entire summers, entire programs just focused on the emotional aspects of those positions, preparing them for being able to make a mistake and own up to it without that shame and blame coming in to disrupt the actual learning that can take place with it. And so it gives me great promise that there's some of that happening, both on the education side with youth and hopefully all ages, and also on the adult education side over in medicine. In my mind, safety of our beingness at any age is the first and foremost place to begin to have safety in our communities, whether it's a school, a hospital, a town, a state, a country, a globe. And I really am, I'm glad to have this time with you. I miss our dream team days when we used to spend hours and hours and hours together working on, these things. We would take 10 days sometimes and just focus here, and I miss those days.
Me too.
That's one of the main things that I miss about Yogi Raj, honestly, is having that in my life every day in a verbal way. I have it, in my spiritual ways right now, which is wonderful and delightful, but I like the chatting about it as well. Roger, thank you for taking the time, and thank you for taking the time to listen today. I hope that you've learned from Roger, and I hope that if you are in another field other than education, that you'll be able to translate what Roger is teaching over into your field. Have a great day.